Welcome to a sleepy journey. But not a boring one. Tonight, we'll turn the pages of the tumultuous history of the Ashkenazi Jews, from their earliest exiles to the deeply ingrained memories of resistance flowing through their veins. There's no need to sit up straight. You're not here for a lecture. This is a soft history, murmured more than told, passed down in whispers beside oil lamps and over bread dough. So, before you tuck in and let your mind wander, maybe leave a like, and if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, feel free to subscribe. Quietly, of course. And hey, where are you listening from? Drop your location and local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake beneath a heavy Mesopotamian dusk, where the scent of baked clay and drying reeds drifts in from the riverbanks. A donkey snorts, unimpressed, as a barefoot child runs past with a shard of broken tablet, pretending it's the law. You smile, though you're not entirely sure why. Maybe it's something ancient tugging at your chest. You're in exile, though nobody uses the word. The first temple fell generations ago. Babylonian streets hum with the low rhythm of Akkadian merchants, Aramaic scribes, and somewhere, always, a whisper of Hebrew, guttural. Resilient, just slightly out of place, like a lullaby sung through clenched teeth. It's here that your people start becoming something else. Not just Israelites. Not just Judeans. But something liminal, dislocated but not dismembered. You keep your calendar, your food, your silences. You read Ezekiel and pretend not to flinch at the burning wheels and bones. You gather on the banks of the river Chebar and chant psalms as reeds sway like old men davening. And when the Babylonians ask you to sing, you shake your head, not out of defiance, but because the songs you carry aren't performance. They're memory, and memory doesn't take requests. There's a strange comfort in the architecture, mud brick walls, low thresholds, communal courtyards that echo with footsteps and half-translated prayers. You build something new here, the synagogue. Not a temple replacement, but a reorientation. No sacrifices, just words. No priests, just readers. And sometimes, if you're lucky, a cantor with a voice like date honey and gravel. Scholars still argue whether this was the moment Judaism turned inward, from temple rites to textual life. Some say yes, the diaspora forged the rabbi. Others insist the seeds were already there, just waiting for exile to water them with longing. Either way, you know the truth in your bones. Something shifts when worship becomes portable. When home isn't a place but a rhythm you carry, your grandmother, or someone who reminds you of her, hums while grinding barley. She doesn't talk much about Jerusalem. Not because she forgets, but because she remembers too vividly. The taste of pomegranate seeds on Sukkot. The way her father wept after lighting the menorah. The silence that followed the fire. Still, she insists on blessings. Over water, over sleep, over the first bread of the week. And when you ask her why, she shrugs, pats your head, and says something like, "So God doesn't forget where we are." Not that he's likely to forget. You remind him often. Shasharit, Mincha, Ma'ariv. Psalms for courage. Psalms for memory. And the psalm that sounds suspiciously like a passive-aggressive complaint, because even in exile, Jewish prayer retains the right to grumble. Sometimes, just before dawn, you think you hear laughter coming from the rooftops. Not the cruel kind, something older, warmer. Maybe angels. Maybe neighbors. Maybe it's just your uncle snoring again, but there's also something else here, something quieter than fear. The slow, stubborn genius of adaptation. The kind that doesn't shout. It needs. It learns the local script. It sets up trade in indigo and spice. It whispers Torah in the alleys and teaches children to chant it backwards and forwards, not because it's required, but because it's all you have left, and maybe you don't know it yet, but this exile won't be the last. It's only the first of many rehearsals. But the melody you carry, the sacred rhythm of remembering while wandering, that's already being composed. There's even a folk tale that the prophet Jeremiah never died. He walks the alleys in disguise, helping lost Jewish children find their homes, whispering old verses when they can't sleep. Your cousin swears she saw him once. He was carrying onions and had suspiciously kind eyes. The exile ends eventually. Cyrus comes, and with him, a chance to return. Some do. Others, like you, stay behind. You've built a life here, layered in lamplight and language and strange, sticky customs. And something tells you the story isn't finished yet, because wherever the story goes next, to Persia, to Rome, to rainy streets far beyond this crescent moon, you're already carrying it. In your breath. In your stubbornness. In the way you correct someone's grammar mid-sentence and then apologize with fruit, so sleep now. The river will keep flowing. And in the morning, someone will chant something old, and you'll remember, faintly, what it meant to start anew. A sandal scrapes the cobbled street as one more scroll disappears into a clay jar no bigger than your hope. The stones of Jerusalem are warm tonight. Still cracked from siege, still slick with oil and ash, but warm, as if the city, even in ruin, refuses to grow cold. You can feel it beneath your soles as you walk past the Temple Mount, now eerily silent. There are no Levites singing, no smoke rising from sacrifices, just the ghostly echoes of prayers caught in the broken arches. You pause beside a fig tree, its leaves curling in the dry wind. Somewhere behind you, someone coughs in Hebrew. Ahead, a Roman centurion barks in Latin. And in your chest, the words of Isaiah stir, not as prophecy anymore, but as a faint protest against what's already been lost. It's 70 CE. The temple is gone, you don't watch it burn. You remember it burning. The sound of cedar beams collapsing, the priest's final shout, the firelight dancing on soldiers' helmets. It doesn't replay in your mind, it replays in your bloodstream. And like everyone else who survived, you do what Jews have always done when there's nothing left to carry, you carry the story. Scrolls are smuggled out beneath cloaks. Torah portions are hidden in psalms. A grandmother stitches verses into the hems of children's tunics, not out of piety, but because parchment tears, and fabric travels, and somewhere along the road to Rome, a child drops his sitter into a stream. His father doesn't scold him. He bends down, picks it up, and says, "Now it's part of the Nile." Let Pharaoh read it, that same humor, dry, absurd, and slightly treasonous, becomes a quiet survival tactic. You can't stop empires, but you can outlive them. And sometimes that begins with a joke about Caesar's nose during Kiddush. Historically, this period becomes the cradle of rabbinic Judaism. The temple-centered rites give way to Torah study, debate, and synagogue gatherings that feel part courtroom, part classroom, part living room. You no longer bring offerings of doves and grain. Instead, you bring questions. Lots of them. Why does the Mishnah repeat itself? Why do we light 2 Shabbat candles instead of 1? And what exactly did Rabbi Akiva mean by that thing about fish and Torah being water? Nobody agrees. Which, paradoxically, is what everyone agrees on. Your uncle, a carpenter with suspiciously fluent Aramaic, says the destruction was divine punishment. Your cousin says it was Roman arrogance. Your neighbor says it was because the Jews fought each other more fiercely than they fought the legions. Scholars will debate this for centuries. Maybe it's all true. Maybe it doesn't matter. What matters is that you didn't vanish, you adjust to Rome. Not easily, but creatively. Jewish slaves build amphitheaters with hands that once built sukkahs. Some are tattooed, some go underground, but many find ways to whisper their heritage into this marble empire. A fringe tale goes that a Roman senator converted after mistaking the Talmud for statecraft, though others say he was just trying to marry a very pretty girl from Judea who insisted he keep kosher. Either way, by the time Hadrian renames Jerusalem and bans circumcision, you're already fluent in resistance. It doesn't always look like rebellion. Sometimes it looks like baking round loaves for Shabbat and calling them souvenirs of the wilderness. Other times, it's memorizing entire books just in case the next guard checks your satchel. Your grandmother, or at least someone who makes the same soup, keeps a small oil lamp burning behind a curtain. She lights it Friday nights while muttering a blessing half in Hebrew, half in Latin, and entirely in defiance. She still remembers the temple songs. She hums them while grinding spices. Once, a neighbor knocks on the door and asks what the tune is. She shrugs and says, "A lullaby for lost cities." Meanwhile, somewhere in the catacombs of Rome, Jews bury their dead beside early Christians, not out of theology, but geography. Space is tight. But so is memory. Every grave gets a name. Every name gets a prayer. The Jewish quarter shifts from quarter to sliver to rumor. But it survives. Because Jewish identity doesn't cling to walls, it clings to rhythm. You still have Shabbat. You still have the Shema. And if you have a little wine and a willing child, you have everything you need for a Seder, even if the Pharaoh now wears a toga. You learn to eat Roman bread but make your own matzah. You trade in olive oil but keep a hidden jug sealed for Hanukkah. You nod politely at statues and then go home and write poetry about dancing bears and the Messiah arriving on a donkey with opinions, and yes, there's still grief. Always. You carry it like a pouch of salt sewn into your robe. But you also carry hope. Not the loud kind. Not the trumpet blasting, mountain-splitting kind. Yours is quieter. It sounds like a child whispering the Eilinu while tying his sandals. Like a mother writing Zion in ash on the doorway before moving house, it's here, among marble columns and cracked memory, that the Ashkenazi journey starts to diverge. Some Jews move east, to the Persian Empire. Others head north, into Gaul, Germania, and the far-off lands where winters bite and languages sputter. The diaspora splinters, not in faith, but in flavor, but for now, you linger in Rome's shadow. Listening. Learning. Waiting for the next turn in the story, because it always turns, you drift with the fog along the Rhine, past wooden shutters that creak with the weight of whispered Torah. The morning fog rolls off the river like a shawl slipping from a grandmother's shoulders, thick, slow, and familiar. You tug your cloak tighter and step lightly on the wooden planks that cross the sleepy Rhineland town. The air smells of damp stone, baking rye, and the faint sting of firewood that never quite caught. There's a cockerel crowing somewhere behind a crooked chimney. And under it, below the thatched roofs, behind the frost-clouded windows, Hebrew letters stir in low, rhythmic murmurs. A boy chants his verses from memory. A woman grinds barley while mouthing a psalm. A scribe sneezes, curses softly in Yiddish that hasn't been invented yet, and returns to his ink pot. You're not in Babylon anymore. You've wandered west, through Rome, through Gaul, into the forested fringes of Europe where Latin forgets itself and Jews begin, quietly, to call this place Ashkenaz. No one knows exactly when or how Jews first settled along the Rhine. Some say Charlemagne welcomed them for their trade and literacy. Others say they arrived with the Roman legions, peddling glass and stories in equal measure. There are even theories, faint, stubborn, and occasionally muttered with a raised brow, that trace Ashkenazi roots to ancient Italy, or even earlier. One old man claims your great-great-grandmother taught Virgil how to season lentils, but here you are. Somewhere between Mainz and Worms, where the stones are older than memory and the Torah scroll is wrapped not just in cloth, but in quiet defiance, historically, this becomes the cradle of medieval Ashkenaz. You build wooden synagogues with low ceilings and thick beams, not grand like the Sephardic courts of Spain, but sturdy, like a promise whispered through generations. You carve out space in trade guilds, in market stalls, and in the margins of society, sometimes tolerated, sometimes taxed, often blamed, but never erased. The quirky tradition arises around this time. When a Jewish baby loses a tooth, you don't tuck it under a pillow. You bury it near the doorstep, so the next tooth grows straight. Someone insists, though you suspect it has more to do with superstition than orthodontics. Still, you do it. Like lighting 2 candles instead of 1. Like not sewing on Shabbat, even if the only thing you mend is your neighbor's gossip, and always, there's the river. The Rhine, winding like a lazy Torah scroll through hills and half-timbered towns. It carries trade, stories, and, occasionally, danger. But it also reflects moonlight in a way that makes you believe in songs older than language. You remember your grandfather's hands, rough from tannery work, stained from ink, as he held your wrist and whispered, "This land is not ours, but these words are." He'd mutter Talmudic riddles while stirring soup, then scold you for answering too quickly. Even the right answer is wrong if you say it without thinking. It's here that Ashkenazi dialects begin to form, a strange, wonderful Yiddish of German base, Hebrew soul, and Slavic elbow room. You speak one thing in the marketplace, another in the synagogue, and something else entirely when you're annoyed. And somehow, it all makes sense. One winter, a child falls through the ice. You pray. So do your Christian neighbors. They don't like your customs, but they like your bread, and occasionally your advice on feverish goats. When the boy survives, they call it a miracle. You call it Shabbat, because honestly, everything that doesn't end in disaster feels like a miracle these days. Scholars later debate whether this era is a golden age or a waiting room before catastrophe. The record is mixed. There's wealth in some communities, constant tension in others. You know a butcher who studies Zohar by candlelight and a beggar who corrects rabbis with impeccable grammar. There are synods, taxes, and the occasional decree that you must wear yellow badges. Though one clever tailor finds a loophole, he dyes everyone's entire coat yellow and dares the magistrate to complain. The Jewish cemetery outside Speyer grows. Stones tilt and sink, names weather into silence, but the rows remain. Each burial is a line in a long, stubborn poem, one you're still writing in your sleep. Your aunt swears that on certain nights, the matriarchs rise and walk the cemetery paths, whispering lullabies to restless souls. You pretend to scoff. But you also don't go out after midnight. By now, the Sabbath is more than a day, it's a homeland. Each Friday, the fog clears just enough for the stars to shine. You light candles. You cover the Halal like a child being tucked in. And in those quiet hours, you're not a stranger. Not a tax subject. Not a suspicious foreigner with odd customs and too many books. You are simply a Jew. And the world, briefly, fits, even if the walls creak. Even if the shutters rattle. Even if someone throws a stone at your door on Sunday morning, you still sweep the stoop. You still plant tulips. You still hum the same melody your grandmother hummed while peeling potatoes in a town 2 rivers away, because that's the quiet genius of it. Not in grand acts of rebellion. But in returning each week to the same words, the same rhythm, the same light, and daring to call it home. Not every Ashkenazi tradition is kosher, especially when it involves imaginary teeth and very real royal extortion. You're standing in the courtyard of a medieval town hall, the kind with too many spires, not enough sanitation, and a pigeon that keeps eyeing your hat like it's a viable nest. Somewhere nearby, a bell tolls the hour, though it's hard to say whether it's early morning or just late enough to feel like morning again. The air smells like wet wood, sweat, and tax season. You're not here for prayer, not today. Today, you've been summoned. Alongside the other Jews of the town, tailors, moneylenders, scholars, bakers, you line up before a magistrate who neither trusts you nor quite understands how you still exist. And yet, you do. Flourishing in spite of it, a parchment is unrolled. Ink glistens like oil in the sunlight. It's the Judensteuer, the Jewish tax. Every name is listed, down to the last coin. You glance over it and see your cousin Mendel described as keeper of poultry and rare teeth. That last part? A joke. Maybe, in some Ashkenazi communities, folk tales begin to form around a mystical artifact, the tooth of a chicken. Supposedly, it brings good luck, or at least, protection from back pain and surprise audits. No chicken, of course, actually has teeth, which only deepens the charm's mystery and its market value. Your neighbor once swore she hid one in her spice box and her husband didn't cough for 6 weeks. Correlation? Maybe. Coincidence? Absolutely, but these are the details history forgets, the peculiar, sideways ways people tried to survive. Because not everything was prayer and persecution. There were jokes. There were fake relics. There were taxes. So many taxes. You belonged to a class known, charmingly, as servi camerae regis, the servants of the royal chamber. Which sounds elegant until you realize it means the king can tax you whenever he needs new shoes. You don't belong to your town. You belong to the crown. And that crown, on most days, is rather heavy-handed. Still, you find workarounds. You form kahals, communal bodies that manage affairs internally. You pool funds for education, for dowries, for ransoms when someone's arrested over a misunderstood proverb. The leaders of the kahal sit on benches worn smooth by generations of sighing, and they debate with the force of rabbis and the exhaustion of bakers. Some decisions are made with great ceremony. Others, like what to do with a rooster that won't stop crowing during Torah study, become heated enough to spark 2 divorces and a new local halakhic ruling. Verdict: rooster may remain, but only if it fasts on Mondays. Your town isn't large, but it pulses with ingenuity. The Jewish quarter curves along a side alley, lined with timbered homes and crooked doors. Children play dreidel in the mud. An old man trades garlic for Talmud commentary. A woman sings to her infant in Yiddish, Hebrew, and that odd German dialect that sounds like it's been translated twice, and yet, for all your cleverness, you remain vulnerable. Pogroms, accusations, royal whims. One year, your cousin gets blamed for a drought, because, of course, your people must have stolen the rain. Another year, the Duke raises the Jewish tax by 1/3 to fund a new hunting lodge. You joke about it over tea, but your mother quietly hides silver spoons behind the mezuzah. Historians later puzzle over why Jews remained in such hostile environments. Why not flee? Why not convert? But they forget the reality of rootedness. You've buried grandparents here. You've planted apple trees. Your family owns 4 goats and 3 recipe variations of cholent that taste like memory itself. Besides, you've lived through worse. You remember stories of Babylon. Of Rome. And you've heard rumors of Sephardic cousins in Spain who live under Moorish rule and own libraries the size of monasteries. Some whisper that one day, you might go there. But for now, the Rhine is your river, and this tax roll, ridiculous as it is, proves you're still here. There's a debate in your town about whether Jews should continue paying for special protection charters, formal documents that state, in lovely Latin, that Jews are under the personal care of the king. One rabbi insists it's shameful. Another says, if we're already paying, we might as well get a receipt. Quirky customs flourish even under scrutiny. On Purim, someone dresses as Pharaoh and shouts legal edicts in rhyme. On Yom Kippur, one family forgets to fast, claims it was a spiritual experiment, and is quietly forgiven, though never invited to host again. Your grandmother, who remembers hiding behind flour sacks during a street riot, still insists on fresh challah, even during famine. If you must mourn, she says, do it with warm bread. And perhaps that's the soul of Ashkenazi endurance, to laugh, to bake, to argue, to remember. To pay the tax, grumble about it, then write a poem about geese in the margins of your mahzor, because someday, a wandering scholar or curious child will find that poem. They'll smile at the ink blot. They'll wonder who Shmuel with the missing thumb was. And maybe they'll understand, not the law, not the ledger, but the life that danced quietly between them. You don't survive by strength alone. You survive by wit. By memory. By burying imaginary chicken teeth under your doorstep and convincing the neighbors it's an ancient right, and somehow, against all odds, it works. Even behind locked gates, someone's kneading dough and singing the same melody your great-aunt hummed with a rolling pin. The gate creaks closed behind you, iron, wood, and centuries of whispered warnings. It doesn't lock loudly. Just a quiet click that lands more heavily in your chest than in your ears. The ghetto closes at sundown, and now the city forgets you exist. But inside? Inside, it glows. You step over a puddle that reflects a crumbling stone wall and a single flickering oil lamp above a doorway etched with mezuzah marks and old nail holes. The air smells of yeast, boiled cabbage, and the soft, sour tang of old paper and older arguments. Somewhere nearby, someone's arguing about a midrash. Somewhere else, someone's singing about fish. You're in the heart of the late medieval ghetto. Venice, Prague, Frankfurt, Krakow, they all rhyme in rhythm if not in accent. You wake in narrow alleyways where shadows are long and windows are small but hearts are very large and almost always busy. The word ghetto itself, some say, comes from the Venetian ghetto nuovo, the old foundry district where Jews were pushed in 1516. Others say it's older. Still others insist it doesn't matter, because what matters isn't the etymology but the recipe for surviving it, and survive, you do, with flair, with fervor, and with a well-honed knack for spiritual multitasking. There's prayer while stirring soup. Law codes debated over laundry. A quiet kaddish said while fixing someone else's doorframe. The Christian world outside grows colder, plague, reformation, war, plague again. And each time, someone needs someone to blame. Sometimes it's witches. Often, it's you. The ghetto walls go up higher, but within them, you build entire worlds. The kahal still governs. Your rabbi doubles as judge, teacher, and part-time marriage counselor. Boys study late into the night, their sing-song Hebrew drifting through frost-covered windows. Girls write poems in Yiddish and sneak them into loaves of bread for the boy next door. Not that they'd ever admit it, you develop customs uniquely suited to confinement. Some families whitewash their ceilings and paint stars above their beds, so the children remember sky, a mother explains, smoothing a blanket. On Sukkot, tiny courtyards bloom with branches, and neighbors share etrogim like sacred contraband. One man insists his lulav is from Egypt. You suspect it's from the back garden. There's a fringe practice in some ghettos, to tuck a written verse into the lining of a child's coat. Not for luck. For memory. Because if the child wanders or worse, someone might find the verse and remember the people who sang it. Your grandmother, or someone with her flour-dusted forearms, teaches you to braid challah tightly. So it holds together, she says, meaning the bread. Possibly the family. Maybe the nation. It's unclear, and you don't ask. Friday afternoon is when the magic starts. The ghetto is still locked, yes, but something shifts in the rhythm. Dust is swept with extra care. The soup simmers with intent. Candles are polished. The table is set. You scrub under your fingernails while reciting Psalm 92, partly for holiness, partly because you know Aunt Rivka will check. Then the sun begins to set. There's no siren. Just a pause, brief, soft, almost imperceptible, when the street quiets. The quarrel ends. The cat stops pawing at the shutters. The butcher rests his cleaver. And then, the first candle flickers. Shabbat, you don't leave the ghetto. But the ghetto leaves you. Suddenly, the walls are no longer a prison. They're a frame. And within that frame, you set the sacred table. You light the candles. You bless the wine. You cover the bread. You become royalty, not in the eyes of your overlords, but in the eyes of your children. The Midrash whispers that when the Shekinah, the divine feminine presence, visits on Shabbat, she doesn't knock. She just slips in through the window with the last shaft of light. You believe it. Or maybe you just want to. Scholars argue whether the ghetto stifled or preserved Jewish life. Some say it was a pressure cooker of intellectual brilliance. Others call it a slow suffocation. You say, depends on the week. Yes, there's suffering. Rats. Taxes. Rumors. The occasional blood libel that sends you hiding in a coal bin. But there's also resilience. There's a 6-year-old who corrects his father's pronunciation. A grandmother who refuses to let grief skip a course at dinner. A candle that somehow burns longer than the oil you put in it. Again, and humor, always. Someone tapes a note to the ghetto gate, closed due to spiritual inventory. Someone else swears the cat is secretly a rabbi. One boy pretends to be the Messiah every Wednesday and refuses to eat vegetables unless they're boiled by a Levite. Meanwhile, Christian visitors come to peer in through cracks and slits, to marvel at the strange lives inside. They don't see the holiness. They see the hats. They see the songs and think they're spells. One records that Jews dance with books, which, to be fair, isn't entirely inaccurate. You finish the Sabbath in song. The candles drip their last waxy sigh. You recite Havdalah. The wine is spilled. The flame is sniffed. The spice box is passed around, cloves, cinnamon, maybe a sprig of something mysterious. You breathe it in. Deeply. Desperately. As if to carry Shabbat with you into the week, because you must. The gate will open in the morning, and with it, the world will return. The carts, the stairs, the suspicions, the tithes, the rules, all of it. But not yet. Not tonight, tonight, behind these creaking shutters and curling candle flames, you are a people not confined, but contained, in the most sacred sense. Held together by memory, by melody, and by the quiet light that dares to burn inside the walls. When truth breaks down, so do locks, and sometimes it's the village midwife who saves you, not the bishop. It begins, as these things often do, with a whisper. Someone says a child is missing. Someone else says they saw him near the Jewish quarter. Then the candle wicks get shorter. The voices get sharper. And someone remembers, or claims to, an old story about Passover and blood and unleavened bread that tastes too sweet to be innocent. You smell it before it arrives, fear, burnt pitch, and the sickening sour of torches held too long, blood libel, they call it. Though rarely in those exact words. You just call it Thursday. The accusation, that Jews murder Christian children to use their blood for ritual, begins in 12th century England with the boy named William of Norwich. From there, it spreads like mold beneath damp floorboards, France, Germany, Poland. Each time, the details change, a well, a wine goblet, a red-stained feather, but the conclusion remains the same. Someone must pay. And you have candles. And knives. And strange songs. So, naturally, you're the safest target in town. Your mother tells you to stay indoors. Your father gathers documents, protection letters, tax receipts, bribes in disguise. Your neighbor sharpens the knives not for ritual, but in case the door breaks down. Meanwhile, someone tries to reason with the local bishop, who nods politely and promptly leaves town for spiritual retreat. How convenient, but this isn't a story of despair. Not only that. It's a story of how you stay alive anyway. With quick thinking, quiet allies, and just enough stubbornness to outlast ignorance. There's a midwife, not Jewish, who lies under oath for you. Claims she saw your whole family playing dreidel that night. Swears the missing boy was last seen eating pears by the monastery gate. Her name isn't remembered. But the girl she saved grows up to be a scribe. And every Megillah she writes has one extra letter, hidden and silent, just for her. You learn to hide in flour sacks. To move your scrolls into pickle barrels. One rabbi buries his tractate under the floorboards, only to forget where, and spends the next decade studying Talmud from memory, correcting visitors with terrifying accuracy. Even at your lowest, there's room for absurdity. In one village, a man is accused of flying to Paris on the back of a goat to attend a secret blood ritual. Nonsense, says the rabbi. He's never left the house without complaining about his bunions. Somehow, it helps. What scholars now call the ritual murder accusation becomes a pattern. A child dies under mysterious or even natural circumstances, a local priest fans suspicion, a town panics, a Jewish community burns. You keep track by memory. That was the year of the red boots, someone will say, when Reuven carved wooden spoons in the cellar. And yet, you stay. Not because you're naive. Because you're entangled. Rooted. Committed to rhythm. Shabbat still arrives. You still grind spices. You still write ketubot with hopeful flourishes. You marry. You mourn. You bake things shaped like doves because your mother says they help ward off bad dreams. A superstition emerges: prick a needle, blunt the tip, and tuck it in your windowsill to confuse the evil eye. You don't know if it works. But your house hasn't burned, so you keep doing it. Your cousin claims to have hidden 13 blunted needles in the synagogue roof, just in case. The roof, you'll note, has held. This is the paradox of the Ashkenazi genius, that you build brilliance in a world that keeps threatening to undo you. And you do it not with grandeur, but with granularity. You know the exact number of steps to the river. The weight of sugar in a funeral pastry. The tone to strike when correcting a Gentile scribe's Hebrew spelling without offending his sense of Latin dignity. Meanwhile, outside your community, ideas begin to shift. Some scholars, brave, bald, and usually banned, argue that Jews are not demons, merely different. One monk writes that blood libel is theology with muddy boots. He's later excommunicated. You light a candle for him anyway, and through it all, you remember, your grandmother hummed Psalm 121 while baking Purim cookies the year the local baron accused her of sorcery. Your great-uncle carved a mezuzah into the back of a pew at his trial, not expecting to survive, but he did. And now, every Yom Kippur, your family places a tiny carving knife next to the honey dish. No one speaks of it. Everyone knows. Modern historians argue whether belief in blood libel was religious hysteria or calculated politics. The truth, as always, is layered. Sometimes the mob really believed it. Sometimes the bishop needed a distraction. And sometimes, the world just wanted a monster to chase. You gave them prayers. They saw spells, you gave them bread. They saw blood, you gave them silence. They heard secrets, but you're still here, and that's the real miracle. Not that you were spared, but that you kept singing. That you taught your children to shape Hebrew letters even while hiding. That you wrapped trauma in folklore, and folklore in dough, and called it ours. Because, in the end, it wasn't truth that saved you. It was memory. And memory, thankfully, has a very sharp spine, even when the needle is blunted. Somewhere in the Polish countryside, beneath 20 layers of wool and one very enthusiastic goose, Torah still burns bright. You wake to the sound of frost crackling on a windowpane, not breaking, just murmuring to itself in that language only winters know. The thatched roof above you groans under the weight of last night's snow, and your breath curls into the air like a prayer you haven't said yet. Outside, it's a world of white. Fields smothered in hush. Trees dressed like ghosts. But inside? Inside, the stove is lit, the onion-scented bread is rising, and someone, probably Moshe the shoemaker's son, is already reciting tractates at a volume previously reserved for roosters and battlefield cries. This is Poland, sometime in the 16th century. You're in a village whose name you cannot pronounce unless you're missing at least 2 front teeth. It sits somewhere between Lublin and nowhere, a speck on a speck in the Jewish atlas of exile. But it pulses with something ancient, something restless, something oddly warm. A yeshiva stands in the center, not grand, not golden, but solid, huddled low against the wind like it knows how to survive. Inside, the benches are worn, the candles drip onto parchment, and the students are halfway through an argument that began last Tuesday and shows no sign of ending before Messiah arrives. Ashkenazi life in Eastern Europe is shifting. After the expulsions from Western Europe, waves of Jews find relative tolerance in the lands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Here, they build something miraculous, a sprawling network of yeshivo, kahals, and shtetls that stretch from the Vistula to the Dniester, and yes, it snows. A lot, but with snow comes silence. With silence comes study. You don't learn Torah here. You wrestle it. Line by line, page by page. Rashi and Tosafot spar like old rabbis in a public bath. The air is thick with heated logic and unwashed wool. One boy explains the laws of Eruv with such intensity, he accidentally catches his scarf on fire. The fire is doused. The scarf is salvaged. The point is made, a fringe tale makes the rounds, that there's a yeshiva so deep in the forest that students must dig a tunnel just to reach the door in winter. They study by the light of pickled fish oil. Their commentary includes footnotes on snowflake patterns. No one knows if it's real. Everyone agrees it probably should be. At home, your mother stirs soup and recites proverbs. Your sister spins wool while humming Shabbat melodies. And your grandmother, of course, keeps a worn copy of Pirkei Avot wrapped in fabric that once belonged to her own grandmother, who claimed to have seen Elijah once at a market, disguised as a fishmonger with suspiciously clean fingernails. Life is hard here, yes. Taxes come often. Pogroms come more often. But between the cracks of fear, something flourishes. Polish kings grant charters. Jewish councils, Vayad Arba Aratsat, negotiate protection, settle disputes, and even issue coins in some towns. Your people begin to feel not just exiled, but established, and then there's the genius. Quiet, relentless, slightly manic genius. Rav Moshe Israels in Krakow writes glosses on the Shulchan Aruch, tailoring Sephardi law to Ashkenazi life like a tailor patching velvet with linen and somehow making it elegant. He walks the line between mystic and halachist with a calm that belies his insomnia. Your town boasts exactly one copy of his commentary, kept under glass, behind two locks, and removed only during festivals or very polite arguments. Meanwhile, mysticism seeps in from the Carpathians. Kabbalists teach that every snowflake carries a letter of the divine name, though you suspect that's just their excuse for not shoveling the walkway. You hear of a new movement rising in Safed, of Lurianic circles and cosmic sparks. But here, under this roof, Torah is not cosmic. It's local. It's in the cracked mug that holds your ink. It's in the stew. It's in the boy beside you, nodding off with his face in bava kama. Still, the tension builds. Between elite scholars and simple folk. Between the learned and the overwhelmed. You hear grumbling, too many laws, not enough potatoes. There are whispers of false messiahs. Of divisions between rationalists and mystics, rich and poor, town and village. One winter, the town council tries to ban dancing during Simchat Torah. Too much injury, not enough dignity. The ban lasts until exactly midday, when the rabbi himself does a cartwheel and declares it an interpretive halakhic act. Even amid hardship, joy erupts, stubborn. Ridiculous joy. At weddings, you dance until your boots fall apart. At funerals, you quote proverbs and still manage to argue about shoe customs. On Purim, you dress your goat as Queen Esther and insist it's historically accurate. And the food, oh, the food. Kasha varnishks, cholent, nadlak thick enough to stop a small quarrel. Recipes passed down not by measurement, but by elbow memory. A pinch, says your aunt, no more than your regret. And stir clockwise, counterclockwise brings bad luck. Historians will call this a flourishing period. They'll tally the yeshivas, note the communal structures, chart the literary growth. They'll forget to mention the sound of a boy studying Torah under a leaking roof while 3 chickens peck at his toes and he doesn't miss a beat. They'll skip the way your grandmother weeps every Friday evening while lighting candles, not from sadness, but from something deeper. From remembering her mother's hands. From hope. From gratitude. From onions. Who knows, you survive because you study. But also because you stew, sing, shovel, joke, and hug when it's too cold to think. The snow doesn't stop. But neither do you. He rode in with promises of redemption, and left behind broken hearts, pawned candlesticks, and some very awkward ketubot. The rumors arrive before he does. Of course they do. They always do. You hear them between milk deliveries and midrash. In the market, a butcher whispers that the Messiah walks barefoot through Aleppo. At the mikveh, someone swears he glows in the dark. A letter arrives from Thessaloniki with handwriting too elegant to be false, proclaiming that the Redeemer has come, and his name is Shabtai Tzvi. You don't believe it at first. You're Ashkenazi. You've been burned before. You still remember the last Messiah, the one with a limp and a suspiciously expensive taste in spices. But then the whispers grow. Sephardi traders confirm it. Kabbalists nod sagely. Even your own rabbi pauses mid-sentence during Rashi to say, well, it's possible. It's 1665, and the world is on fire. Your cousin sells his ox to buy a seat on a boat to Izmir. Your neighbor sews a new dress and stops fermenting cabbage, no use stinking up the end of days. Someone paints their doorposts gold. Someone else stops paying taxes entirely. This, as you'll discover, is premature. The air smells of burning pine and wild hope. And something more dangerous, release, because for generations, you've bent under the weight of exile. Under crusades, pogroms, sermons you weren't allowed to respond to. Now, suddenly, someone is lifting that weight. Saying it ends now. No more waiting. No more fasting. No more exile. Shabbat Tzvi is young, intense, utterly unreadable. In Izmir, he walks the docks barefoot, quoting Zohar and shouting things that sound like prophecy and possibly indigestion. His followers sing new psalms. Women faint. Merchants send him gifts wrapped in velvet. He marries the Torah. Literally. There is a ceremony, you hear that he's declared new festivals. That he's riding to Constantinople to claim his crown. That he can silence the wind. Your uncle swears his gout improved just from hearing Shabbat's name. Your grandmother remains unconvinced. If he were real, she mutters, he'd have written back about that chicken soup recipe I sent him. Still, you light extra candles. Just in case, in Poland, Hungary, Germany, Jews prepare for redemption. Yeshivas pause. Weddings are rescheduled for after the redemption. One man tattoos the Hebrew letters for Messiah on his arm using a fishbone and pure hope. You'd think your community, rational, chilly, and deeply suspicious of exuberance, wouldn't fall for this. But you do. Not all of you. But many, because hope is contagious. And suffering is cumulative. So when the news comes, that Shabbat Tzvi has been arrested by the Ottomans, that he's been given a choice between death and conversion, and that he converted, you feel it not in your head, but in your knees, you collapse inward, he becomes Mem Defendi, a Muslim courtier. His closest disciples claim it was a holy secret. A mystical descent to raise the divine sparks from within. Others say nothing, just quietly resell their land and begin refasting on Tuesdays. You don't talk about it much, even centuries later, his name is mumbled. Shabtai becomes shorthand for delusion. And yet, scholars still debate, was he mad? Brilliant? Both? Did he mean it? Was he trying to save the Jews, or simply himself? Some say he believed it. Others that he simply couldn't stop once the avalanche started. A few claim the pain of the Chmielnicki massacres, just decades earlier, made people so desperate for hope that they accepted it in any form. Even a barefoot mystic who sometimes sang too loudly, your community doesn't fully recover for a generation. Ketubot written in his name are quietly rewritten. Babies named for him are discreetly renamed Shlomo. And a new skepticism settles into the bone, not cynical, just cautious. One good thing emerges. Sort of. From the ashes of disillusionment rises Jacob Frank, another mystical charmer who preaches strange theology, eats meat on fast days, and eventually converts to Catholicism with hundreds of followers in tow. You try not to judge. But your aunt swears his kugel was always suspiciously underseasoned, so what remains? Not the Messiah. Not the gold-painted doorposts. Not even the letters of prophecy, now faded and used to wrap pickles. What remains is the rhythm. You return to it. Slowly. Shamefaced. Grateful. You say the prayers you paused. You clean the wax from your Havdalah candle. You explain to the children, gently, that sometimes people are wrong, even when they sing beautifully. And your grandmother? She's still humming. Still peeling potatoes. She adds a little extra salt that night. It's good for wounds, she says, not looking up. You learn, perhaps painfully, that not every fire is divine. That not every glow means redemption. But also, not every fall is final, and maybe, just maybe, that too is part of the genius. When your world shrinks to a line on a Russian map, sometimes salvation comes in the form of a root vegetable and a stubborn lullaby. You blink at the news, not that it's surprising, but it's never less bitter. A new decree, a new line drawn on a map, a new reminder that borders are not always fences, sometimes, they are cages. It's 1791. Catherine the Great signs the ukase, and just like that, a whole civilization is penned into the Pale of Settlement, a belt of land stretching from Lithuania to Ukraine where Jews may legally exist, and nowhere else. Outside the Pale. Trespass. Inside. Tolerated. Until further notice, you live inside now. Most Jews do. The air smells of wet hay, boiled barley, and pipe smoke, the kind that clings to beards and books alike. You can almost taste the mud as you step outside in your patched boots. It's thick, clingy, and filled with secrets. Somewhere behind you, a baby is crying in 3 languages, your shtetl is small, 2 muddy roads, 1 synagogue, 12 opinions. The horse is no more gossip than the people. Every fence leans slightly, as if listening in. But within this humble geometry, a world blooms, Talmud and trade, lullabies and libel, and one very wise goat who allegedly reads psalms backwards. Life in the Pale is contradiction incarnate. You're surrounded by fertile soil you're not allowed to own. You're taxed for everything, from salt to Sabbath candles, but still manage to host weddings where the music alone could revive a fainting man. Then comes the potato. Imported, at first, with suspicion. It grows underground like secrets, your aunt mutters. But soon, it becomes salvation. Cheap, filling, hard to ruin, harder to praise, but it keeps bellies warm and children alive. Entire philosophies are born over potato peelings. Some argue it's a divine gift. Others claim it's God's apology for pogroms. Either way, it's grated, mashed, fried, and, in one failed experiment, pickled. Your uncle never lives that down. Under Tsarist rule, Jewish life is squeezed tighter and tighter. Censorship. Conscription. Surveillance. Boys are stolen into the army at 12, sometimes younger. Your grandmother weeps every time a boy hits his growth spurt. The conscription officers arrive like wolves, polite. Sharp, hungry, a rumor spreads, if you break a boy's finger, he won't be drafted. Another, if he stutters, they'll pass him over. There are whispers of girls dressing as boys and boys dressing as shadows. Some hide in chimneys. Others disappear altogether. Still, you build, yeshivas flourish, mostly in basements. Rebbes travel from town to town in sleds filled with sidurim and pickled herring. Hasidism spreads, warm, emotional, mystical. A balm against the dry bones of decree and exile. You see it in the songs that now rise with more tremble than tune. In the prayers that stretch long into the night, echoing like frost on window panes. Some scholars resist. Too much feeling, not enough thinking. But even they, deep down, feel the chill softening when a Hasidic nigun curls through the air. You remember your grandfather's hands shaking as he wrapped tefillin in a drafty hut. The cold makes it holy, he said. You have to mean it more. Women become Torah in motion. With official study barred, they teach in kitchens. A girl who can recite psalms backwards is treated like royalty. They memorize, preserve, transmit, not just text, but tone. Inflection. Emphasis. You learn more halakha from your mother's kugel than from any printed page. Of course, there are pogroms. They come as storms, sudden, senseless, sharp. Cossacks with torches. Villagers with debts. Soldiers with orders. Synagogues are burned. Houses looted. Torah scrolls trampled. One man hides his prayer shawl inside a flour sack and continues davening under a bed. The next morning, you sweep the ashes. Patch the door. Someone plays a fiddle. Someone else makes tea. Life resumes, not out of cheer, but necessity. Because silence is too heavy to carry forever, a fringe custom arises. During storms, families light one extra candle, not for safety, but to spite the darkness. If they must burn something, your aunt says, let it be ours. On our terms. With a wick we choose. Scholars debate the pale. Was it prison or preservation? A cultural coffin or a crucible of genius? You say, yes, from this sliver of Europe comes a torrent of language, thought, music. Yiddish becomes not just a mother tongue, but a cultural universe. Proverbs bloom like weeds, God gave burdens, also shoulders. If the rich could hire someone to die for them, the poor would make a living at it. Better to be the tail of a lion than the head of a herring. You wear them like armor, cleverness as resistance, irony as insulation. The 19th century grinds on. A boy named Hirsch becomes a secular scholar. A girl named Chaya becomes a revolutionary. A man named Yankel makes a violin from a broken bed frame and plays it at 6 weddings and 1 funeral, his own, and still, Shabbat comes. You scrub, polish, bless. You light 2 candles, place your hands gently over your children's heads, and whisper the same blessing your mother whispered when her house was half rubble and half recipe, because the pail may shrink you on a map, but it cannot shrink what you carry in your breath. They say you should always keep one packed, not because you plan to flee, but because you know what history has planned for you. It's the kind of quiet that feels planned. Birds not singing. Wind not bothering. The neighbor's goat not shrieking its usual protest at sunrise. Just a stillness that settles in your bones before it reaches your ears. You already know something is wrong. You can smell it in the coal smoke. Feel it in the way your mother skips the humming part of her morning prayer. Taste it in the tea she makes twice as strong and half as sweet. The knock comes just after dawn. Not a pounding, not yet. Just a firm, rhythmic command. You don't answer. But you don't have to. Because this is not a unique day. This is a pattern you've memorized, even if you never dared write it down. It's the late 19th century now. Somewhere in the Russian Empire. Maybe Odessa, maybe Minsk, maybe just that nameless little town with a crooked steeple and a synagogue roof patched with someone's old wedding canopy. Wherever it is, it's not safe anymore. Pogroms, this time with paperwork. Anti-Jewish riots erupt, not just wild bursts of fury, but coordinated events with police looking the other way. Sometimes even providing the lanterns. A loaf of bread is thrown through your window. Then a rock. Then something worse. Furniture is overturned. Torah scrolls desecrated. Girls scream. Men shout. You hide under the bed with your little brother, pressing his face into your coat so he won't see the candlelight dance in a way no candle should. When it's over, if you're lucky, the roof still stands. If not, you dig through ashes. Either way, you pack, because by now, every Ashkenazi family has the suitcase. Or the bundle. Or the wooden chest with the good ladle and the letters from Lublin. It's always half ready. Not because you're paranoid, but because you're practiced. Inside, a sitter, 2 pairs of socks, 1 photo, 1 cracked silver spoon, and that brittle piece of paper declaring you're a citizen of somewhere you've never actually seen. For travel, your father says. In case. He doesn't finish the sentence. By the 1880s, a new term spreads among you like the flu, America. A land of gold streets, factories, freedom, and a total absence of grandmothers who insist you rewash the fish. You don't trust it at first. But then the cousin writes. She says they have indoor toilets and pickles the size of small horses. She says you can pray or not pray, and the police won't come either way. She says Yiddish sounds funny when spoken in Chicago but works just fine, and so begins the Great Migration. Between 1881 and 1924, more than 2 million Jews leave Eastern Europe. Mostly Ashkenazi. Mostly poor. Mostly clutching those suitcases and breathing those prayers you can now recite backwards and in sleep. You travel by cart, then train, then boat, always sitting near someone with a cough and someone else with a violin. The ships stink. The customs officers shout. But you endure. Because you always do. At Ellis Island, they ask questions no one has ever prepared you for. What is your name? Simple. Do you plan to become a burden on the state? Not if the potato crop holds out. Can you read and write? Yes, but not in anything they recognize. They change your name. You don't fight it. You nod, swallow, and start practicing your new one on the boat ride to Manhattan. In some families, the old name becomes a nickname. In others, a ghost. Back home, the pogroms continue. Kishinev. Białystok. Warsaw. Each with a new tally of loss, and a new letter arriving 2 weeks later that begins, "Thank God we are alive." And ends with, "Please send cloth, and if possible, money." And yet, not all leave. Some stay, out of pride, or poverty, or the kind of loyalty only forged in soot. They rebuild. Again. And again. Each time a little thinner. A little more tired. You hear whispers now of new ideologies. Zionism, socialism, Bundism. Movements that speak of dignity. Of workers' rights. Of homeland. Of Hebrew reborn and Yiddish uplifted. Young people argue late into the night in back rooms above bakeries, their voices as urgent as their shoelaces are untied. But your grandmother? She still boils water at sunrise and sets aside a crust of bread for Elijah. In case he's cold, she says, and that's the truth of it. The genius isn't only in the ideas, it's in the habits. In preparing tea during sirens. In packing what matters and leaving what doesn't. In marking time by parsha and porridge and passport stamps you didn't ask for. Historians will note the economic shifts, the legislative expulsions, the rise of modern anti-Semitism. They'll mention the 1882 May laws and the quotas and the Tsar's silence. But they won't smell the burnt sugar. They won't hear the soft panic in your uncle's voice as he hides his Shabbat candlesticks under the floorboards. They won't see the exact way your mother folds the prayer shawl so it fits just right in the bottom of the case. They won't know you sleep with your boots on, and maybe they shouldn't. Because this part, this suitcase part, isn't for textbooks. It's for lullabies. For whispered blessings over border fences. For the memory of the town that no longer has a name, but that still appears in your dreams with a crooked sign and one window lit, so you carry it, and when your children ask what's inside, you tell them, just socks. And memory. Even as the world industrializes and forgets your name, someone still sells rags door to door in 6 languages, and hums Psalm 137 into static. The city hums now, not with Torah, not quite yet, but with trolley bells, smokestacks, and the scent of overcooked onions steaming out of tenement windows. Welcome to the Lower East Side. Or maybe Montreal. Or Leeds. Or Johannesburg. It doesn't matter. If there's laundry strung across the street and someone selling pickled herring out of a barrel, you've arrived. You walk past newsboys with ash-smeared faces, pushcarts creaking with second-hand pots, and signs in English, Yiddish, Polish, and whatever that is. And then, there he is, the ragman. A fixture. A legend. A smell. His cart is older than most countries. His horse may be an accidental saint. He calls out in a voice rasped by smoke and cold, rags. Rags. Bottles. Bones. Some Torah, if you've got it cheap. You don't ask his real name. No one does. But somehow, he knows every child's face and every grandmother's bad hip. He trades cracked mirrors for blessings and old coats for silence. If you're lucky, he'll tell you the story of how he once sold a broom to Albert Einstein's aunt. It's probably not true. But that's not the point. You've made it to the new world, but the genius didn't get left behind, it just put on new shoes. You study now in night schools after factory shifts, poring over English textbooks with Hebrew vowels penciled in the margins. One boy hides a copy of the Talmud inside a math workbook. He says he's practicing word problems. You let him. There's no yeshiva here, not yet. But there's a tailor who quotes Maimonides while measuring inseams. A dentist who insists his Novocaine has been spiritually purified. And a 10-year-old girl who writes poems about the 10 plagues while babysitting her siblings. The lice stanza is particularly vivid, it's a hard life. The factories are loud, the landlord's louder. Your hands are calloused, your shoes don't match, and your cousin still insists on feeding the pigeons with the bread meant for dinner, but you're free, you can walk where you want. Pray how you want. Shout in public, marry for love, open a bookstore named after your mother's soup, some do. Many don't, not everyone finds the promised land so promising. For every successful newspaper editor with a waxed mustache and high hopes, there's a peddler walking 5 miles in snow just to sell a comb. Some lose their way. Some lose their accent. Some lose everything but still wake up humming Sabbath tunes in factories that don't know from Friday night, and then. The radio, it arrives like a miracle. No, like a minion in a box. You huddle around it in a boarding house with 14 other cousins and one confused cat. Static crackles. A voice sings out in Yiddish. Another tells the parsha of the week. Someone makes a joke about fish and the Sitra Achra. The room roars, you've entered the age of Jewish airwaves. Of songs carried over oceans. Of sermons shortened for sponsors. Of Hasidic melodies followed by ads for kosher cough drops. And you? You eat it up with a spoon and maybe a little rye bread. In this new world, Torah doesn't vanish, it shape-shifts, the ragman's son becomes a labor organizer. The matchmaker's niece studies medicine. The yeshiva boy now moonlights as a union treasurer with a sideline in socialist poetry. Some mourn the loss of the old ways. Others say, we're still here, aren't we? Scholars debate whether this era marks the decline of tradition or the birth of reinvention. Is Yiddish dying? Is Jewish identity thinning like your uncle's hairline? Or is it just making room for new kinds of genius, in factories, in film, in the soft glow of an electric menorah shining from a tenement window at dusk? Your grandmother, now wearing orthopedic shoes and yelling in 3 languages, still lights the candles every Friday. She uses a cardboard box covered in tin foil as a tray. Still weeps at La Chadodi. Still burns the onions, on principle. You remember her saying once, after the landlord raised the rent again, at least here they let you curse God in peace. Then she kissed the mezuzah anyway. There's a tale told in your neighborhood about a man who smuggled a whole Torah scroll inside a phonograph box. Played jazz for the customs officer. Later turned it into a study circle in the back of a barbershop. He now offers haircuts, aliyahs, and unsolicited marriage advice, all within 30 minutes, the ragman. Still out there. Still calling. His beard's grayer now, but his voice carries. Sometimes you hear him and remember who you are, not because of what he sells, but because he remembers your shoe size from when you were 7, and the radio? Still playing. Somewhere, someone's listening to the Aleph Bet song between English lessons. Somewhere else, a girl in Detroit hears her first Yiddish lullaby and cries without knowing why. Your people adapt. You joke that Jews are like cockroaches with better fashion sense. But really, you're like dandelions, pushed down, paved over, and still finding ways to bloom in sidewalk cracks, because genius, it turns out, doesn't only live in Talmud pages or golden shtetls. Sometimes it lives in a shoebox apartment with 4 beds and 5 siblings. Sometimes it rides a creaking cart through alleys, singing into the soot, and sometimes, often, it just keeps going. No maps mark it, but you know the smell of cholent and the gossip of geese on a muddy lane. You've never been back, not really. The house was torn down long before you were born. The road's been paved. The mikveh is now a tire shop, and the old cemetery has 2 headstones and a cell tower, and yet, somehow, you still live there, not in the geography. But in the rhythm, in the way your fingers still flinch toward a scarf when the wind blows a certain way. In how you tap a melon 3 times before deciding it's ripe. In how you lean in too close during a story, whispering as if the geese might overhear, because the shtetl was never just a place. It was a weather system. A smell. A layout of spirit more than street. Mud in every season. Gossip in every wind. Soot-stained elbows pressed over stews that simmered all day while someone explained why Rashi was wrong, and also probably right. There were thousands of shtetls, Bratslav, Zinkiv, Brody, Medzabiz, dots on a crumpled map you inherited in the form of lullabies and recipes. Most of them are gone now. But that doesn't matter. The shtetl still whispers. It just found new places to hide. Your grandmother brought it with her, packed between the candlesticks and a jar of pickled something that leaked on the boat. Your grandfather found it again when he built a wooden porch 3 inches too crooked. Because it's more honest that way. It was never quaint, by the way. That's what tourists think. No, it was grimy, stubborn, alive. It smelled of onion and wet wool. It had 1 good violinist and 12 bad ones. It had secrets. And chickens that wandered into the Beit Midrash. And a fishmonger who insisted he once studied astronomy. The cholent was always slightly burnt. The streets were never fully dry. And every child had at least one story about hiding from the Cossacks, even if it happened to someone else's village. Still, it was home. The shtetl trained you to listen for contradictions. The rabbi who banned coffee, but drank it anyway. The pious beggar who quoted Torah by heart but also cheated at dreidel. The cow that wouldn't give milk on Shabbat, divine miracle or peasant laziness. You never decided, and oh, the arguments. Every fencepost knew at least 2 positions on Maimonides. The shoemaker refused to speak to the scribe after the incident with the matzah and the goat, and no one remembers what the incident was. The mikveh lady once stopped a blood libel by quoting Psalms until the accuser wept and apologized. Some say the shtetl was a cultural prison. Others, a greenhouse of genius. Scholars still bicker about whether it stifled women or birthed quiet revolutions behind samovars and closed doors. Your aunt. She just shrugs and says, I survived 3 pogroms and 5 cousins with opinions, same thing. Here's the quirky part no one outside understands, you knew the mud. Each patch had personality. The kind near the bakery smelled sweet. The kind by the synagogue sucked at your boots like a desperate debtor. And then there was the frozen kind that made the whole town walk like they were carrying invisible Torah scrolls, the sounds, boots on boards. Roosters arguing with distant prayers. The quiet knock of a visitor too polite to interrupt a sermon, but too cold to wait. The cough of the oldest tailor, whose sneezes everyone blessed because they sounded like prophecy. Even the superstitions had character. You'd knock twice before entering the root cellar, just in case a dibbuck was brooding. Some people buried a shard of broken mirror in the barn to ward off envy. Others hung garlic by the mezuzah, for flavor, they claimed. No one believed them, and when things went wrong, as they often did, someone always said, it's because we forgot to sweep after sundown. Which explained nothing and solved less, but somehow made it all feel less lonely. Remember your cousin in Brooklyn who swore he'd forgotten the shtetl? And then he stopped shaving during the 3 weeks. And yelled at the neighbor for hammering on Shabbat. And cried when he smelled borscht made just right, not too sweet, not too sour, just like that one Tuesday in Cuddy when the world almost ended but didn't, because you don't outgrow a shtetl. Not really, it's not just that it lives in your bones. It becomes the bones. In the jokes. In the timing of a sigh. In the way you instinctively check a stranger's hands to see if they once carried wood or bread or something holier. There's a story passed around, always in a whisper, always in past tense. A shtetl boy leaves home to become a big city philosopher. He gets famous. Writes books. Denies everything. One day, he sees an old man in the market humming a tune from home. He stops dead. Follows him. Says nothing. That night, he doesn't write. He just boils water and peels a potato slowly, singing the same tune under his breath, off-key, and finally honest, because the shtetl doesn't ask for belief. It asks for memory, and whether you're in Vilna, Brooklyn, or somewhere between a deli and a dry cleaner in Melbourne, the wind still carries a faint smell of wood smoke and onion, and somewhere, always somewhere, someone is yelling, "Close the door, you'll let the cholera in." Ashkenazi genes don't tell the whole story, but they do hum a curious tune about candles, cleverness, and cholesterol. There's a test now, a vial of saliva and a prepaid envelope, that claims it can tell you who you are. It arrives in a cheerful box, decorated with a swirling double helix and a promise to reveal your ancestors. You stare at it. Tilt your head. Wonder whether it will remember your great-grandmother's hands peeling potatoes in the dark. The scientists call you an anomaly. A blip. A concentration of rare genes in unexpected places. Ashkenazi Jews, about 10 million worldwide, descended from perhaps just 350 individuals in medieval Europe. A bottleneck, they say. A founder effect. They make charts about it, you listen politely. Then slice an apple and mutter, "Tell me something I didn't know." Because survival? That's not news. That's inheritance. You come from people who outlasted empires with nothing but bad shoes and good timing. From families who measured distance by how many candles they could carry without blowing out. From a lineage that understood instinctively that if the road forks, you take the muddier one. It's harder to track. Still, the science is interesting. Researchers find elevated IQ averages among Ashkenazi descendants, higher rates of certain cancers, a knack for mathematics, and a peculiar relationship with cholesterol. One scientist proposes it's due to natural selection under centuries of oppression, a survival of the cleverest. Another says, coincidence. A third mutters something about soap making in Frankfurt and walks away. There's no agreement. Only data. And questions, but you've met enough uncles to know it's not about intelligence, it's about urgency. When life is a moving target, your brain learns to pivot fast. When your calendar includes both fast days and surprise evictions, you memorize, you joke, you survive. Sometimes all at once, the candle, the cleverness, and yes, the cholesterol. That part's not a myth. Your bub could fry air. She believed butter was a mitzvah and onions cured heartbreak. Her kitchen produced miracles and borderline medical conditions. And yet, she lived to 94 and remembered every line of Lamentations, even when she forgot your name. There's a joke told in academic circles, Ashkenazi Jews are overrepresented in both Nobel Prizes and neuroses. You laugh, carefully. Because beneath every punchline is a puzzle. Is it really about genetics? Or did generations of yeshiva logic, Talmudic parsing, and Sabbath storytelling wire the mind differently? Is the brilliance baked in, or is it just cultural cholesterol, the stuff that clogs you up with memory, meaning, and 5 competing opinions on breakfast? You remember sitting on your father's lap as he read aloud from a book that had more footnotes than sentences. You didn't understand a word, but you understood the rhythm. The logic. The pleasure of untangling meaning from layers of ink and maybe even disagreement, because that's part of the survival too. Not answers, but layers, a simple verse. You find 70 interpretations. A broken law. You argue it back into wholeness. A problem. You host a dinner and talk about it until dessert. Someone cries. Someone sings. No one agrees. But somehow, it works. There's a legend from Prague, a boy born under a strange moon who could calculate astronomical tables in his sleep. They say he was the Rebbe's nephew, or maybe the butcher's son. Either way, he vanished during a pogrom and was later rediscovered in Paris, writing equations on wine labels and forgetting to eat. You've met versions of him. In labs. On subways. In back rooms of bookstores filled with old Hebrew volumes no one can lift but everyone refuses to discard. You recognize the tilt of their heads. The muttered math. The need to know, but here's the thing. The genius isn't in the blood. It's in the ritual, in the way your people practiced memory like it was oxygen. In how even the poorest child was expected to argue with a scholar, as long as they brought a good source and a decent sandwich, in the soft stubbornness of building one more school, one more mikveh, one more row of books on a crumbling shelf, because survival isn't just being alive. It's remembering how to live. Science says you're exceptional. History says you were never meant to make it this far. You sit somewhere between miracle and footnote. And yet, here you are, lighting candles, asking questions, frying onions like it's a family rite and possibly a medical experiment. There's a smell from your childhood, it comes back now. Brisket, paper, floor wax, and cinnamon. You can't name the moment, but you can feel it: safety, sharpness, warmth. A kind of fierce peace only found in rooms where books outnumber chairs. That, too, is part of the code, so yes, maybe there's something in the genome. But you'll still take your grandmother's theory: cleverness is like schmaltz, you don't need much, but you better know where to put it. Even after the pyres and pogroms, you keep lighting that candle, because some memories are older than fear. It begins with silence, not the cozy kind, like before a blessing or after a joke finally lands. No, this one is thick, hollow, stunned. A silence made of smoke and shoes and names no longer answered. The war has ended. That's what they say, at least. The trains have stopped. The gates are open. Somewhere, a typewriter declares a ceasefire. But you're still waiting for someone to knock and say, "Come out now, it's over." No one does, because for many, there's no one left to say it. 6 million is a number. You've seen it in headlines, etched on marble, chanted in classrooms. But in your dreams, it's not 6 million. It's your Aunt Rivka's laugh. Your cousin Eliezer's boots. The crooked mezuzah on the bakery door. Gone, Europe forgot. The villages burned. The language choked in ashes. The rhythm broke, but not entirely. Somewhere, maybe in the displaced persons camp outside Munich, maybe in a basement in Krakow, maybe in a one-room flat in Tel Aviv, someone is lighting Shabbat candles again. 2 small flames, shaking. One for creation, one for memory. You light them, too. Even when your hands tremble. Even when the match won't catch, and that's how it begins again. The scholars debate it now, how the Ashkenazim rebuilt anything after that. Entire family trees uprooted. Entire towns razed. Archives incinerated. A civilization collapsed. And yet, by the 1950s, yeshivas reopen. Books are reprinted. A boy in Brooklyn begins his bar mitzvah lessons using a Talmud smuggled in a soldier's duffel bag. Not resilience, something deeper. A refusal to forget. You carry it in gestures now. The way you fold the napkin corner just so. The way your child hums a nigun they learned from a teacher who learned it from a man who sang it once in a cattle car. The Germans recorded everything, of course. They were meticulous. Inventoried possessions. Measured cheekbones. Filmed the last breaths of empires. But they didn't understand memory. They didn't know what it means when someone in Melbourne still boils eggs just like their great-grandmother in Moravia. Or when a prayer whispered by a girl in Siberia matches the one found scribbled in the margins of a pre-war siddur. In a way, you become the archive. Your grandfather doesn't talk much about the camps. But every Friday night, he closes his eyes for Lachad Dodi and presses his fingers to his lips like he's trying to remember how to kiss a word. You ask your mother what Bergen-Belsen means. She doesn't answer directly. Just tells you to finish your soup and be kind to the neighbors. Later, you find a crumpled photo in her drawer, 4 children and 1 old woman. All looking slightly left of the camera. Behind them, a fence. The old woman is wearing your nose. There's a story, maybe true, maybe not, of a man who survived Auschwitz and refused to speak for 20 years. Then, one morning, he went to synagogue and read the Haftorah aloud, weeping through every verse. No one asked him to explain. No one needed to, because in the Ashkenazi way, remembering doesn't always look like remembering. Sometimes it's a recipe. A melody. A nervous glance when someone knocks too hard on the door. The extra lock. The hidden pouch of passports. The suitcase by the stairs. Europe moved on. Built malls where yeshivas once stood. Erected plaques in front of what used to be mikvehs. Tourist guides now explain Jewish quarters in 6 languages. This is where they lived, they say. Past tense, but you know better. You know that every time you recite the Modeh Ani, eyes still half shut, mouth dry, you are declaring war on forgetting. Every whispered Baruch Atah is an act of rebellion. Every time you teach a child to read the Aleph Bet, you are pulling memory out of the fire and wrapping it in a shawl, and every Friday night. When you strike the match, wait for the wick, then cover your eyes, you are, for one glowing second, standing in every kitchen that ever was. From Mainz to Minsk, from Berlin to Borough Park. You're there. All of you, because even if they burned the house, they couldn't burn the light, and even if they forgot, you didn't. In the end, the answer isn't a location, it's the rhythm in your rest, the lull in your labor, and the story you hum without knowing why. Your shoes have crossed too many borders to be loyal to any one flag. The soil keeps changing beneath your feet. Even the word Ashkenazi, it doesn't mean home. It means somewhere else, at first. It meant Germany. Then Poland. Then wherever you landed with a satchel and a sidelong glance. And always, even when you unpacked the candlesticks, it meant, this is temporary. You've gotten good at that, at being from wherever you aren't. Good at planting memory in borrowed ground. At building homes from stories and resilience from rituals. You've done it so long, it no longer feels like exile. Just, custom. There's a man in Toronto who still chants the same Friday night melody his great-grandfather hummed on a shtetl porch. A woman in Buenos Aires who needs halal like her mother did in Krakow, same wrist turn, same whispered blessing under her breath, like a spell against forgetting. The world calls it diaspora, you just call it Tuesday. There's a tired joke, everywhere we've been, we've left behind books and bakeries. But it's true. In every city where you stayed long enough to catch your breath, you built a library, a bakery, and an argument. Usually in that order, the scholars still debate where you came from. Was it Palestine? Rome? Khazaria? Rhineland? All of them? None. They chase your genome across centuries, like detectives trying to reconstruct a melody from half-erased sheet music. But your grandmother never needed a DNA test to tell her who she was. She had stories. Scars. That one lullaby she sang only when someone had a fever and the windows rattled, she belonged to a place not on any map. A place that existed between soup and song, between the creak of the floorboards and the sigh at candlelight. She never called it history. She just called it Friday, and you. You carry that rhythm, even if your Hebrew is halting, even if your menorah is electric, even if your only link to the past is your cousin's overcooked kugel, you still know when the week turns soft. You still feel it in your shoulders, the slowing down, the setting sun, the breath that remembers to be full. Shabbat, in the end, is your homeland, not a land of borders and treaties, but of pause. Of return, a sanctuary stitched together by memory and intention. Some say it was the Jews who kept Shabbat. Others, that Shabbat kept the Jews. Maybe both are true. You rest, not just from labor, but from exile, from the need to prove, to remember, to argue. You let the story hold you for once, and in that stillness, you understand, it was never about being from somewhere, it was always about becoming someone, the kind who lights candles in the dark. The kind who sings even when they don't know all the words, the kind who plants a seed in soil that isn't theirs and waits anyway, because one day, someone will ask where you're from, and you'll smile, and say, a little bit from Babylon. A little bit from Brody. Mostly from the kitchen, right after the soup started to boil. You were always from somewhere else, but you always knew how to arrive. Now, the candles flicker, the room is quiet, the story has been told, and somewhere, a child is drifting off to sleep, to the hum of a lullaby their ancestors didn't know they remembered. So now, dear listener, you can rest. The candles are low, the words have softened. And the journey, long, winding, oddly familiar, has brought you home. Even if you never left your room, you've wandered across deserts and dynasties, through ghettos and gardens, past wedding halls and war zones. You've carried scrolls in the dark, whispered blessings over broken bread, and paused, again and again, in the hush of Shabbat. Not to forget the weight of the world, but to remember your place within it, because history doesn't always live in books. Sometimes, it hides in the steam above a soup pot. Or in the creak of floorboards before dawn. Or in that one melody no one taught you, but somehow you know. And through it all, you've inherited something quiet and unshakable, not just survival, but the rhythm of rest. The art of beginning again, the genius of lighting one small candle, and letting it be enough, so breathe a little deeper now. Let the stories settle like snow. The debates can wait. The clocks can pause. You've earned this stillness, somewhere far back, or maybe not so far, a grandmother is humming. A child is listening. And a people, though scattered, are at peace for just a little while, because tonight, even history needs to sleep. Now, close your eyes, let the quiet wrap around you like an old shawl, let the rhythm of exile and return become your lullaby. You are not alone, you never were, and you've always known the way home.